Vaughan Williams and Holst were best friends. They probably had a stronger musical friendship than any two composers I can think of, with the possible exception of Mozart and Haydn. Their friendship was so strong that they could be absolutely brutal in their criticisms of one another's music, which is not to say that they were ever nasty, but they could tell the other one, you know, I just don't get this piece, or I don't think this comes off, and it never impaired their friendship at all. If anything, it made it stronger. Vaughan Williams, for years, felt, I think, a little bit guilty that he, Vaughan Williams, overshadowed Holst, and when The Planets finally received its first public performance, Holst was the man of the hour, and far from being jealous at all, Vaughan Williams, I think, breathed an internal sigh of relief, saying, thank goodness that my best friend is finally getting his due as the great composer that he is. The Planets is so familiar now that we tend to forget what a revolutionary work it was in terms of the way that Holst deployed the orchestra, the materials themselves. And needless to say, it's become one of the most influential works of the 20th century. I mean, without Mars blasting out its rhythm, there might be, dare I say it, no etc. There, I did say it. As is frequently the case, approaching a very familiar piece of music that I've never conducted, I've been surprised and happy to discover that there are some things in the piece that are simply usually not done according to the text itself, and we at the Philharmonic have been working very hard to bring that about. One of the interesting ones is in the sixth movement, Uranus, where the second theme, one usually hears as etc. And the rhythm is actually clipped. The little upbeats to the first two gestures are actually eighth notes instead of quarter notes. So it should be, which is a great deal different than if you actually execute the rhythm the right way. The crispness of it gives it a little more of a tude, which we've had a great time exploring at the Philharmonic during our rehearsals. Holst had no way of knowing that World War I was going to erupt when it did, and yet he started writing Mars, the bringer of war, a couple of months before war was declared. He said that he sought to describe the stupidity of war. And I remember the first detailed rehearsal that we had of this movement at the Philharmonic. I got pretty graphic. I read them one of the anti-war poems of Wilfred Owen. And then I said, I don't want you to play this movement with any sense of heroism, with any sense of glory. So we're going all stops out and making the first movement as potent an anti-war statement as we can. And then Holst pulls a total 180-degree and gives us Venus, the bringer of peace, which is about as tranquil and soothing and serene a symphonic movement as can possibly be. Probably the most famous movement of all is Jupiter, which has everything from a lusty country tune to a tune that took on a life of its own, practically as an anthem. That was another interesting discovery we made in the course of rehearsals. So often in performances of the Planets, the orchestra gets to this point and they just dig in with but Holst marks it mezzo forte at the beginning, you know, medium loud, so that you have some place to which to grow. And when we actually manage to suppress our natural tendencies to want to dig in at first, played it with a little bit of reserve at first, and built to the forte that he asked for, it was much more moving. Sometimes less is definitely more. Vaughan Williams is a fascinating case of a composer that the public thinks that they know very well, based on the pieces of his that have risen to the top and are most performed and most broadcast on the radio. We tend to think of him primarily as a composer steeped in folk song, and indeed he and Holst made many, many ventures into the English countryside, collecting folk songs from peasants and other people who had been singing them for decades, if not centuries. So we tend to think of Vaughan Williams as the person who would take an English folk song and put it into beautiful orchestral dress. Or as somebody who would take a beautiful theme from English church music, as he did in the Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis, and again, weave his orchestral magic with it. But there were many other facets to his musical personality, and certainly a lot of the music that he wrote after he turned 60, which is to say the least known works, indicate that he was very much aware of trends in 20th century music. He was too much of an individualist ever to climb on anyone else's bandwagon, but he certainly took what he needed from the extant vocabulary of the 20th century. And when his Fourth Symphony came out, it was a shocker to many people who only associated him with his pastoral or his church music side. The Fourth Symphony, which he wrote when he was in his early 60s, begins thusly. And that was a major shock to the world of music. Nobody had ever heard a work like that in England. And it's that spirit, that tough, uncompromising spirit, that infuses a lot of his piano concerto, the least known of his 4 concerti for solo instrument and orchestra. I was able to very gently twist the arm of my colleague Cristina Valdez to learn this concerto, especially for this concert. And it's going to be a pretty striking occurrence for those who think that they know dear, comfortable old Uncle Rafe.